How the U.S. repeatedly cushioned the fall of imperial Russia. The savior's paradox. In politics, there are plots that repeat like a bad dream. The history of U.S. relations with Russia/USSR is exactly like that. Every time the Kremlin system approached the brink of collapse, whether due to famine, technological backwardness, war, dissolution, or financial default, the West entered the fray, often under the banner of humanism, stability, or global security. Thus, a paradox was born. A country that declared a struggle against the imperial threat repeatedly helped that very threat survive. This work is not about America loving Russia. On the contrary, the motives varied, from humanitarian and pragmatic to strategic and cynical. But the factual outcome often looked the same: a system that should have collapsed under the weight of its own crimes and mistakes was given oxygen. Post-World War I, the famine of 1921 through 1922, and American nutritional resuscitation. The first major episode was the famine in Soviet Russia in 1921 through 1922. For the Bolshevik state, this was a crisis of legitimacy and survival, war, devastation, drought, and management failures. It was then that the U.S., through the American Relief Administration, or ARA, led by Herbert Hoover, launched a massive aid operation. According to researchers and journalistic reconstructions, American efforts reached a level that today would be called a humanitarian logistics mega-project. By the summer of 1922, the ARA was feeding millions of people daily. Time cites estimates that American programs fed up to 11 million Soviet citizens a day and provided seeds that saved the 1922 harvest. This was simultaneously humanism and soft power. However, in a strategic sense, it was a moment when a regime that had just launched the Red Terror was not left alone with the consequences of its own policy. USSR industrialization, American technology as the backbone of the Soviet machine. The second episode is less obvious to the general reader: American participation in creating the industrial base of the USSR in the 1930s. The Soviet industrialization project was often presented as an internal feat, but in reality, it heavily relied on external knowledge, engineering, and procurement. Historians and review materials record a series of pivotal cases: collaboration with Ford to create automobile production in Nizhny Novgorod, a contract with the American firm Albert Kahn and Company as the leading consultant for Soviet industrial construction, the participation of American firms in designing and supporting major metallurgical and energy facilities, including the Denier hydroelectric station, consulting, turbines, etc. This doesn't mean Americans built the USSR, but it does mean that totalitarian modernization received American blueprints, technological tips, and management practices. For the empire, this was not a gift. It was an injection of modernity that strengthened it in the 20th century. World War II, Lend-Lease for the USSR, 1941 through 1945, as the fuel of victory for the USSR. It's important to distinguish between the moral and practical levels. Morally, the alliance with the USSR was forced, the Nazi threat. Practically, without massive supplies of equipment, food, and materials, the Red Army's ability to wage war would have been significantly weaker, if not impossible. The National World War II Museum in the U.S. emphasizes that from the fall of 1941 to 1945, millions of tons of food, raw materials, and equipment flowed to the USSR from the U.S. Data lists specific categories: trucks, locomotives, fuel, food, communications, raw materials, the things that turn an army into a mobile system rather than a mass of infantry. The value of U.S. deliveries to the USSR amounted to $9.129 billion as of June 30, 1945, or 28% of all U.S. deliveries to allies. While the dollar amount is significant, the physical quantities are truly staggering. Over 14,450 aircraft, including nearly 9,700 fighters and nearly 3,800 bombers, 7,000 tanks and 3,200 armored scout cars, 35,000 motorcycles and 2,200 repair vehicles, 8,200 anti-aircraft guns and 135,000 submachine guns, 343,000 tons of explosives, 105 submarine chasers, and 195 torpedo boats. Vast amounts of food, canned goods, sugar, flour formed a separate artery. Lend-Lease also included locomotives and rail cars, the backbone of logistics on the scale of continental war. These supplies reached the USSR via three main routes: the Arctic convoys, the Persian corridor, and the Pacific route. Historical paradox: Lend-Lease helped defeat Hitler and simultaneously helped the USSR emerge from the war extraordinarily strengthened and with an imperial appetite that later materialized in the Iron Curtain. Today, Russian leader Vladimir Putin claims that the Soviet Union would have won even without the Allies. The collapse of the USSR and the 1990s. Aid so it didn't explode. The fourth episode occurred after 1991. The U.S. and its allies feared chaos, uncontrolled nuclear arsenals, the spread of materials and technologies, civil conflicts, and unmanaged migration. Hence, massive programs to support transformation and security were launched. The most simplest was the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction, aimed at reducing the risks of WMD proliferation in the post-Soviet space. This was a pragmatic step, not love for Moscow, but fear of an uncontrolled catastrophe. In the 1990s, bush legs were a symbol of the post-Soviet space's food dependence on the U.S. The result, a catastrophe with nuclear arsenals, was indeed avoided. However, the political evolution of the RF moved toward revanchism. In other words, they stabilized it so it didn't blow the world up and simultaneously preserved the core of a future threat. The 1998 default, the international battle for stabilization. The fifth episode was the Russian financial crisis in 1998. International institutions, IMF and World Bank, agreed on large support packages, and the U.S. politically supported the Stabilization of Russia line. RFERL in July 1998 wrote about a $22.6 billion package as an attempt to support the ruble. The announcement had a psychological effect, signaling to markets that Russia will not fall today. After the August collapse, reports of humanitarian aid packages appeared to prevent food shortages. The LA Times wrote about agreements for a package exceeding $600 million, the largest in 6 years at the time. Again, the logic worked. When the Russian system approached the edge, the world tried to place a cushion so the fall didn't drag others down. Obama's reset, an attempt at reset as a policy of hope. The sixth episode was the reset of U.S.-Russia relations in 2009 through 2013. Washington tried to reduce tension and find areas of cooperation after previous crises. The symbol was the famous reset button handed by Hillary Clinton to Sergei Lavrov in March 2009. In retrospect, the reset is often evaluated as a policy that gave Moscow a window of legitimacy, but did not change its strategic culture. Is the U.S. saving Russia from defeat in Ukraine? The U.S. is saving Russia from defeat in Ukraine is a political interpretation rather than an established fact. However, there is a noticeable layer of publications where Donald Trump's rhetoric regarding a quick deal is evaluated as potentially beneficial to Moscow. Territorial concessions, limiting Ukrainian capabilities, pressure on Kyiv. Conversely, there are materials emphasizing U.S. participation in security guarantee formats for Ukraine. The real assessment depends on the content of future agreements and enforcement mechanisms. Conclusion: why they saved it again and again. If you assemble these episodes, a hauntingly logical picture emerges. 1921 through 22, famine, humanitarian rescue. 1930s, industrialization, technological nourishment. 1941 to 45, Lend-Lease, material basis for war endurance. 1991 to 2001, post-imperial stabilization and risk control, including nuclear. 1998, financial support to avoid collapse. 2009 to 2013, reset as a policy of hope and pragmatism. 2025 to 2026, debate over whether a deal becomes a lifeline for the RF at Ukraine's expense. Why did this happen? Because the U.S. and the West often acted on the logic that it is better to stabilize an enemy than to face chaos involving nuclear weapons and global shocks. Today, a major factor is China, which is pulling Russia into its orbit. However, it must be remembered that every safety cushion for Russia had a side effect. It postponed the moment of historical responsibility and kept the imperial instinct alive. This has led to the current situation where Russia seeks to destroy the West, starting with Ukraine.